We have some breaking news coming in. India-Canada face-off escalates a day after India raised Canada interference. Canada moves majority of diplomats out of India. Well, after India demanded parity with Canada, majority of diplomats moved to Singapore is what we've been given to understand. So this is the story that we are, in fact, it is developing. And this after, remember, India demanded parity, diplomatic parity, asking downsizing of the Canadian embassy and also to move out diplomats out of India by way of diplomatic parity, and that's what Canada has been forced to do indeed.
Insofar as discussions on parity, as we mentioned earlier, given the much higher diplomatic presence of Canadian diplomats or diplomatic presence here in Canada and their continuing interference in our internal affairs, we had and we have sought parity in our respective diplomatic presence. Discussions are ongoing on the modalities of achieving this. Canadian diplomatic presence is very much higher. We would assume that there would be a reduction.
Gaurav Sawant is joining us with more details on that story. Also, my colleague Shiv Arun continues to be with us. India, Shiv, demanded diplomatic parity and said the deadline is 10th of October. Canada essentially has been forced to meet that deadline. Shiv.
This is an enormous win, not just for Indian diplomacy, but it's also a signal, Sneha, that India has sent out to the entire world that it is not going to back off once it takes a decision. If Canada, a first world country, has decided it wants to raise the stakes, raise the temperatures, interfere in India's internal affairs, via its diplomats and consulates, then India is going to use that opportunity to flex back at Canada and remain completely unbending on this very sensitive issue. Remember, on September the 19th, Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, had begun his attack on India by naming India in Canadian Parliament. Just 2 days later, on 21st of September, the External Affairs Ministry at that time itself had said India seeks parity, making it very clear that India was aware that consulates of Canada in India, which is in Bengaluru and Canada, in Chandigarh, specifically in Chandigarh, were perhaps involved in nefarious activities, in what the Indian government is calling interference in internal affairs. Remember that India's decision to hold its ground and order these diplomats to get out comes 2 days after the Canadian government had actually visibly softened its stance. So that in itself is a huge power play here. It basically means India is not willing to back off. It is not willing to step away from this game that Canada triggered, that Canada began, and it's going to use this opportunity to not only impose its will on a first world country like Canada, but also send out a signal to the West that India is not a pushover anymore. Its foreign policy is independent, it's autonomous, it is reliable, and it is unbending.
Absolutely. And Gaurav, what a climb down it has been, from hurling accusations at us, talking about credible allegations, to then saying, let's talk in the private, isn't it, over the last few weeks or so?
So as far as Canada is concerned, Canada fired the first shot. Some in Canada claim that they tried quite diplomacy earlier with their top diplomats flying to India and sharing details of what they thought was credible allegation of alleged Indian involvement or potential Indian involvement. But India brushed it aside, saying this is not evidence, show us evidence, and Canada hasn't been able to show any evidence. And this is a question of facts. It's not a question of what Canada may claim. Hardeep Nijjar, and let's take this chronologically. Hardeep Nijjar was killed on the 18th of June. Who is Hardeep Nijjar? Hardeep Nijjar is a terrorist. There is an Interpol red corner notice against him, and not once but twice. Hardeep Nijjar belongs to a terrorist organization called the Khalistani Tiger Force. He was linked to the Babbar Khalsa International. Who are these Khalistanis? They've already targeted an aircraft, Air India Flight 182 in 1985, in which 300 people, including 268 Canadians, were killed. 20 pregnant women were killed in that terror attack. Was any action taken against Khalistanis? No. Hardeep Nijjar was taking forward that same ideology, preaching hatred towards India and actually being involved in armed attacks in India. India sent out a red corner notice for his arrest. Canada did not arrest him. Then perhaps whatever happened on the 18th of June, it's for the Canadian investigators to carry out that investigation. no suspect, no arrest, no case charge sheet, and yet India was blamed. All of this just goes on to indicate that Canada was trying to build castles in the air with no essence on ground. And India's big point has been Canada's interference in India's internal affairs. As Shiv rightly pointed out, it's happening in Chandigarh through their consulate in Chandigarh, through their consulate in Bengaluru. They also have a consulate in Mumbai. Their mission is much larger, more than 3 times larger than the Indian mission in Canada. So India sought parity, not just in seniority, but also in numbers. Now it remains to be seen whether Canada is able to produce any evidence, and evidence that will stand scrutiny in a court of law.